There we go. Okay, so underinvesting in the young. I refer to this as history's biggest error in social policy. And this is giant. Remember that I am talking about really all history. One thing stands out that there's a lesson that seems to have been globally learned, which is that nobody achieves universal primary education without having the taxpayers pay for most of it. That's just so clear. Nobody ever did it. There were a few attempts. They were abandoned. Okay, if that's such a general lesson, why did it happen so late? This didn't really get going until the 19th century. Why? What's going on before then? That is a big question. And to set up why I think it's true, I will first start with this reminder here that the underlying premise is correct, that investing more in the young, for which in this talk I'll be talking mainly about subsidized public education, is in fact highly profitable in terms of overall aggregate growth. It's got a very high rate of return. The literature says so, even though the literature cannot include what we all wave our hands and talk about qualitatively, which is positive externalities. Okay, for example, those high rates of return again. Now, every study that I would cite has its own, has its own limitations. But this set of studies that by Tsakharopoulos and Petrinos, usually with the World Bank, gives a general pattern that is very durable. All of these rates of return, I don't know if you can see the third one, the higher education one. Sorry, go back. In my case, my view of you folks is blocking it a little bit. So I think I want to just, okay, now I can see everything better. Okay, the rates of return are all high relative to any real rate of interest. They're especially high in low-income countries. And this suggests massive underinvestment in this very large aggregate sense. Okay, that is true, and I think that's been true for much of history. I want to go, since this is sort of related to history, this group, I want to go to early modern England and the others and pick up on the time period when, let's see, am I? And I'm sorry. Okay, that's the slide I need next. I'm coming to them exactly on this point. There are three main reasons why, excuse me, this could have happened so late. First of all, the obvious one that I think most of us would think of first is, well, it really doesn't pay in pre-industrial economies to invest a lot in education because basically we are all farmhands or else political overlords. And you don't need much education for either of those. That sounds correct, and it fits the occupational distribution of the world up until early modern period. But sometime around the beginning of the 17th century or so, I think that is no longer true. And I'll go on with that next slide to illustrate that thanks to changes in the way that interest rates evolved, in addition to changes in wage rates, occupational structure, and tax rates, I think Western Europe broke through this barrier and made it really profitable with high rates of return for all of society to invest in education. Really what was required was the commercial revolution. And once that was in place, it would have paid society to have invested much more heavily than it did. Second, insufficient fiscal capacity. We know the fiscal capacity literature. The nation states of early modern era began to get the capacity to engage in a significant amount of government expenditures funded through taxes, and could begin to afford some civilian government expenditures. Western Europe, for a moment, Mughal India had that capacity, Tokugawa Japan as well, as long as we define what the daimyo received as a share of product as a tax, which in my view it was. Okay, so by 1600, both of these constraints, low returns to education society at the level of society or insufficient government fiscal capacity, I argue that both of those constraints are gone. And it's only this third one here that really counts. And from then on, we are talking about the political will to pay taxes to send other people's children to school. That is the crucial dominant constraint from then on. So I want to illustrate that by saying that from, say, the 1600s, I'm getting very squishy here about where in the early modern era I'm beginning this. From then up until the 19th century, modern England and others are leaving money on the sidewalk in terms of economic growth. And I really hope that other people kind of pursue this sort of exercise themselves. In the early modern period, the way I look at it, right as the British and the English and Dutch were emerging as leaders of commerce and industry, they were also missing this other key component of development of capital that would make the economy more productive. We have a wonderful literature now on the development of property rights. You know that literature in this era. But schooling, what's going on here? They are underinvesting. And as I've said, Adam Smith said so. He thought there should be universal schooling paid for by the, he gave it a hint as if it were means tested, but it was basically universal, to be paid for by taxpayers. Thomas Jefferson thought also there should be universal schooling for white children, paid for by taxes. They're right. Okay, now in the case of England, my book argues that at least as far back as late 17th century or early 18th, when you look at the structure of wage rates, tax rates, and interest rates, you already get high rates of return on primary education. I'm going to be emphasizing primary. And I calculate some of those rates of return for 19th century England. So this table, which I'll look at part of, only the first row there, calculates what would be the different returns to different parts of society, including the parents, from having the son, first it's the son of a laborer, receive enough schooling, in that case, 3 years schooling to achieve signature literacy, and probably a bit of numeracy that went with it. Okay, I calculate that for a son born, he would have been born around 1814, married around 1840, and getting into the marital records then, etc. Okay, I have rates of return here, internal rates of return that I compare with the British consols, a general real interest rate, say. Okay, rates of return for whom? Well, and rates of return from what? Well, the action that is generating these rates of return is a hypothetical willingness of government or government donors to pay for this schooling altogether. So they're doing that. And given that they are doing that, starting from the left, the private family is getting, of course, a wonderful rate of return, because the only cost to them of having this child go to school is the opportunity cost of losing the wages, losing some child wages. Then I'll skip to the further over here to the right side. Over here, this is kind of a rest of society rate of return. Now, unfortunately, I have these donors in here because in the actual historical context I'm talking about, there were private donors paying for some such things for sons of laborers. But now suppose that the government paid for all of that. It retired the donors, got them out of the picture, and had to pay for all of it. Then the government would, as this larger public, get 13.6% rate of return. Excellent rate of return, well above the console rate. Society as a whole, meaning the parents and the rest of them, gets 19%, a very handsome rate of return. Okay, now that rate of return excludes the positive externalities because those are so hard to measure. And if we now said not sons, but sons and daughters, you would have to reckon on the fact that these calculations play on paid, away from home work, etc. Suppose that we had females added into the calculation with 0 of these external adult earnings, etc. Even under those pessimistic terms, there's footnoting in the book about it, these still give rates of return far above the general rate of interest. So society is clearly missing something as a whole. Even the government, or the government taking on this entire public role, could have gotten money back for its own budgets through the later taxes that these educated sons of laborers, daughters of laborers would have paid. Okay, that's all being passed up. Again, my dominant reason is that they failed to, they simply failed to see that it was in their self-interest. They didn't have the political will. Now, there's a part here that I would consider that interesting, but I've agreed that I want to get past that, this section 1D. So let's go to today. You will recognize easily enough that everything I'm saying here from the sweep of history is, fashionable today. I'm not alone. I'm not the person making the breakthrough. You can always visit Jim Heckman's website, the Heckman equation. You can see all sorts of literatures. This is just going everywhere. We now realize that not only did you get rates of return that were higher for primary than for secondary than for higher education, but you also we're now deciding that the rates of return on pre-primary are very high. So say the longitudinal econometric studies, they're very clear on that. And this is a major policy issue right now. It's one on which the United States is lagging behind other countries, but it often turns out to be the case that many of the best data sets, large data sets for quasi-experimental techniques, et cetera, do come from the United States. Still, it's the Americans who do the least of this among the usual club of rich countries. My book can only add that the broader history will agree with this current policy consensus, which is very 21st century. Again, always that basic point. Too many societies are underinvesting in their young. Okay. Now, on the issue of school, etc., you might be interested in something on which I'll touch shortly here, just briefly now. We can also give tentative verdicts. This is new with me to try to pull these things together. On the heated debate over parental school choice and voucher subsidies, etc. This is an increasing topic of the post-war era. The idea of parental school choice and having the taxpayers pay for both public and private funding. It comes from 3 things. First of all, deeper history of the political settlements of the wars about schools and religion. Second, Milton Friedman. His voucher scheme articulated in 1955 is very worthy of consideration. And then third, urbanization. That is to say, people have a greater opportunity to actually choose which school, thanks to urbanization. In a highly rural and thinly populated countryside, you can't do that. I mean, where could you go? Transport costs are too much. So that's the third. But of these 3, I want to emphasize the role of history here. And as you can see in my work, I've begun to expand on how these issues got resolved early and institutions of this sort actually evolved. I emphasize Netherlands, Belgium, and a little bit of France. My apologies, you can see my blue on the right if it isn't covered by the other people in the view. Danish school choice is not covered in the book, but I know of Viberg and Larsen's, sort of very agitated article on this in March of 2017. This should be a hot issue for Denmark as well. Okay, now, those are the sources of it. And from all of that, I distill a policy prescription about how institutions of choice should relate to public finance and to schooling. Okay, here's the 3 things that I think everybody would need. Public subsidies, yes, for private and public schools, both. enforcement of equal opportunities for parents to choose. Note the next phrase is extremely important. Independently of their income and ethnic or religious background. So real demand side freedom and equal opportunity. To make that work in a case where you have school choice, you will already be able to sense that you need to have some kind of mechanisms like lotteries or something else that enforces fairness, but you need that. Now, so far with my numbers 1 and 2 here, I may sound like giving you the arguments in favor of something like vouchers, a la Friedman. But as the American conservatives, at least, were very slow to realize, to go with this, you absolutely have to have centralized controls on schools' selection process, which kinds of students they admit, on their pricing, and on curricula. In terms of admissions, they can't do a lot of social sorting. They can't top up with extra fees. They can't allow the parents to pay extra fees and simply get a better school than others with the same central subsidy. And in the end, you need centralized, really secular exams that the education is held accountable to. Okay, the third one is something that certainly the religious right never would have wanted to hear, but it absolutely has to be true. And the quickest way to remember why this would be true, it has to be true in your country and mine, is suppose we were to say that there are to be no such centralized controls. Really, any madrasa can receive taxpayers' money for schooling. That would suddenly put the issue into political context today. And in the fight between Catholics, Dutch Reform, Protestants, and others 100 years ago, they faced the same issue, and their compromises had to deal with that fact. They ended up with centralized control and really a very secular kind of education, even though a religious institution is allowed to be the provider. Okay, now those are the prescriptions that I think history will say. I really would love to have somebody else do the truly deep comparative history of this issue. These prescribed features, however, have already been successfully delivered in many countries without the formal voucher programs. See the book about that, but Japan, Korea, Finland, etc. They've worked out these features that I have listed there. They don't have any school vouchers, and this has been a source of puzzlement for those who wanted to push the voucher idea. Okay. Let me quickly just comment on the worst voucher case and then a good one. They're listed right there, just to be really fast. Chile is a famous case where under the dictatorship of Pinochet, they imported this Chicago and Milton Friedman idea, and let's have the taxpayers pay for all private as well as public schooling. Chile is a bad case, the worst case, because the econometric results by Shea and Urquiola and others have made it very clear there are no efficiency gains. There's no evidence that this is improving the quality of Chilean education in the aggregate. It does heighten and worsen the inequalities of education because Chile was allowed to violate those yardsticks that I gave to you, those political recommendations. They had topping up and they had enormous amounts of social sorting. Basically, this became a way where in urban areas, the upper classes could make sure that really only their children were all in school together, and the taxpayers helped them make that possible. So Chile didn't work well, and then under democracy, this began to be chipped away at because of its inequalities. And finally, under the second, around the time of the second term of Michelle Bachelet, the whole voucher experiment was phased out. Chile doesn't have it anymore. Sweden since 1982, an interesting case. Bernmark and Lindahl have an interesting study because they have been able to take longitudinal data over several decades here. And they find that if you have what they call the independent schools subsidized on equal terms with the general public schools, that you do get efficiency gains. Now, interestingly, the efficiency gains are in the form of external effects. That is to say, the way you demonstrate that there's better learning going on over as these people become young adults is you find it at the level of the city, basically, or the locality. The gains are there and spread out over everybody. They are not restricted to those who are actively choosing the independent schools. Those who did not make any such choice in an area where that kind of competition is relevant, think larger urban areas especially, they are gaining as well. And go see the study by Billmark and Lindert to see how they deal with the issue of the immigrants, the people from different cultures, making schools work in Malmo, etc. It has worked out pretty well, and its competition is the mechanism. But they did that by delivering a very egalitarian kind of competition that I've described. So see their article. There's universal subsidies, egalitarian parental freedom of choice, and centralized controls on the supply side. It's very complicated how they decide who gets, like the immigrant child whose parents want them to go over to the other school and things like that. That's complex, but it works out quite well in that respect. Okay, now our favorite theme for Peter and myself, elderly bias in social policy, etc. He's got good titles on pro-elderly welfare societies, etc. about this. And I'm thinking along the same lines. Okay, I have this snapshot. First, I'm going to show you everything that happened up to 2010 from time zero, which was, well, 1910, say, because everything you see here came from zero, came from the origin 100 or 120 years earlier. So that's a sweeping long-run change that I'm looking at here. Okay, here's how countries differ. And let me tell you about my axes. If you lie across your table at 90 degrees, you can read this axis, which is public education per child, per person of ages 5 to 19, in school or otherwise, as a percent of GDP per adult of working age. That's support for kids variable. And support for elderly, similar. Public pension benefits per person who's 65 and up, not per retiree, per person, just, they may be getting them or not, but per person, elderly person, as a percentage of that same GDP per adult of working age. Okay, now countries differ in this. What am I going to squeeze out of this kind of comparative diagram? Well, first, as you can see emphasized here on the left, up is good. The first thing you want to know about this graph is that you want to be higher up it. Okay, but why? Well, let's see. Up means you're spending more per child relative to adult carrying capacity. Is there, if you get way up near the top, are you spending too much? I have never seen any literature that shows us that there's this incredible waste, which means that, say, at the top here, Denmark would have been better off if they'd spent only half as much in their education. I've never seen that literature. So up is generally good. Basically, these are decent performers from everything we can get from international exam comparisons, things like that. So up is good. That's the first way to read the diagram. Anybody up. But now countries have chosen, some of them are doing badly down here because they're doing badly on anything public. India is over in here somewhere. Philippines, etc. That weird country there, I think, is Bhutan. Okay, so there's that case. But as you can see, I'm quite interested in what's going on out here, where countries really are spending quite a bit of public money on the elderly, not on children. Now, to get your eyes accustomed to the task of singling out these countries, I put in those slopes. what the slope of 1.0 or the slope of 0.4, neither of these has any economic content to it. These are just visual aids so that you can see, well, there's a few countries up here that really, are near the top, New Zealand, Canada, et cetera, Denmark close, in emphasizing children over the elderly. Down here, this is the group I want to talk about. Many countries are diverting money from the young to the elderly quite generously. And some of these cases, look at that. I spend most of my time where the literature helps me most, which is on Turkey and Brazil. I comment on Mongolia as well. These others I don't comment on very much. But say Turkey and Brazil, they're spending a lot. As a matter of fact, look at those. Those look like you would almost think the what they call the replacement rate was very high. Wow, are you getting, like 60 or 70% of a wage rate each year when you're an elderly? Well, most people are not in those countries. That's my other point here on the left. It's especially to elderly elites. These are regressive transfers from people who pay general sales taxes, etc., the general public, toward pensions for government and other formal sectors. There's been a lot written about how scandalous this is in Brazil, for example, and it's been extremely difficult to get rid of this problem in Brazil. I've talked about this, as do others. But here they are out here. They've spent some money. There's not an easy conversion of these magnitudes into these magnitudes, but they've clearly spent money down here that could have been spent up there, and with much better effects on economic growth. The book also says, as I didn't bother to say in the printed remarks here for the talk, that, excuse me, when you spend more on primary and secondary schooling, you're also leveling the educational attainments of all adults. So there's actually a hidden contribution to later, decades later, equality in these countries by getting it right and having the extra support aimed at children. Okay, now that was my great sweep back there from all the way up to the year 2010, the latest on which I could get 106 countries from 120 years earlier. And you can see countries' behaviors are contrasting. Now, what's happening recently? So here's my pivot here. I do a couple things on this slide. I'm kind of changing things around in here in a couple ways. First of all, I want to get to discussing up here at the top, whose behavior is being, whose bias in favor of the elderly is being checked, and whose policy biases are getting worse lately. Now, lately is going to actually meaning starting in the around 1990. But first, I have to set up how I'm going to measure that for your purposes in today's talk. There's a simple way that I have of showing who is drifting in the direction of further elderly bias. Okay, I have this simple accounting identity here. What is spent on pension benefits equals what is paid for them. What about deficits? Oh, don't worry about deficits, because deficits simply means you're paying for them with taxes. It's in the future, not in the present, but it's being paid for. So basically, I take the pension benefits and equate them with something over here, which is the tax rate I'm discussing further, times the tax base, which is the number of young adults times their average GDP per young adult. Okay, that's an identity defining my T. It's not that I know that this is a behavioral tendency in societies. I want to use that to define T. Okay, and when I simply rearrange those terms, here's what it means. I want to get T on the left because I want to talk about it and watch that a lot. This net tax rate, the money that pension programs take away from other social spending on the young and from the taxpayers in general. Okay, now T equals the product of two things. First of all, the demographic ratio, the elderly share. Obviously, that's going to rise until the year 2050. that's going to go up. But we would like to keep T from rising. You know, there must become some point at which T just cannot go on rising forever, because you'll lose, the taxpayers will lose too much, and or the potential beneficiaries of programs for the young will lose too much, etc. So that, well, how would you keep T from rising when we know this will rise? You have to make this other term drop, which is to say, the annual benefits, and now you'll watch how Peter is constantly throwing in this word annual as a reminder. The annual benefits per elderly person must drop relative to the annual average earnings, GDP per person of working age. They cannot rise as fast. They must, as I say it up here at the top when introducing this section, they should fail to keep up with average incomes. You can see where this is going to, where trouble is going to arise. Suppose you simply index your annual pensions to an average wage rate. Uh-oh. If the society is aging, I'm reminding you of a serious problem here. Okay, so who's been heading in the right or wrong directions? I need to wrap up pretty quick here. First of all, I want to focus on the events since 1990, but first of all, I'll remind you that everybody ramped up the generosity of elderly support in 1960 to 1980. This is an early post-war thing. Then that was kind of wobbled around across the 1980s. Since 1990, after that plateau, only a few countries have clearly shifted away from elderly bias. I have these 4 in green that I've emphasized in the book. And on the measure that I'm showing you today, Germany would also qualify. So a very diverse group, Chile, Latvia, Netherlands, New Zealand, Germany. Okay, who are the bad behaviors? Down here, think Brazil and other Latin Americans, Japan, and the Southern Mediterranean, doing very badly. On these measures here, Finland and France and Hungary and Poland are also not doing so well. So I now will just quickly emphasize here 4 pairs of diagrams that will show this. Now, in each of these diagrams, on the left, I have that support ratio. Remember the thing that was on the axes here? It's support per elderly person in relationship to general average incomes. And on the right, I translate that into the kind of the payoff in terms of what share of society's national product is being siphoned away by pensions. On the left, I have the United States, which I have in several of these graphs. This is kind of a middling sort of baseline case. Since 1990s, nothing in particular has been happening with the Americans. And same thing on the tax rate over here. As society aged, this might threaten to rise, but it didn't very much for the United States because the United States population didn't age that much in comparative perspective. Now you can see what I'm going to say about Japan. Since the 1980s, they are just like the Americans in the generosity, which is, you know, below European standards, but generosity of pensions, and they've kept it pretty stable. Uh-oh, but that equation said, if the society is aging, you're in trouble in terms of gobbling up a larger and larger share. For Japan, now up to 11% plus of GDP. Okay, so Japan is out of control without getting more generous. It's not that since 1990 they got more generous for the elderly. They just didn't have the courage to make them fall behind on the ratio sense that I had shown earlier. Chile did have reforms, especially since 1990, which is the start of the resumption of democracy. They did prune this down, and Chile did better on the education front, so that Chile did not have any rise since 1990 in the share of GDP taken up by the pensions. Okay, another sort of English-speaking graph here. My main purpose here, to keep it short, is to talk about New Zealand. New Zealand, in its own little way, just overdid what other countries did in the mid-1970s in a kind of a general statist or leftward shift. They really did a lot. And they actually had a political showdown You can read it in the authors that I cite from there, where they realized when troubles began to hit in the early 90s, the elderly were getting just far too good a deal. And New Zealand clearly has cut this down. They are the best, clearest case. Okay, Mediterraneans. Now, remember, this is the ratio which, since 1990, with an aging population, really needs to be reduced. Well, Italy, maybe a little bit, but they are just not facing the music and making the pensions per elderly person rise more slowly as they should relative to average incomes. And with this result, the share of GDP that is being taken up by these public pensions just has kept marching up. In all of these cases, allow me to consider Portugal Mediterranean for the purposes, for expositional purposes. Okay. Now, finally, well, I had to get a graph with Denmark in there. So here we are. Here's a graph with Denmark in there. I have Denmark and some near neighbors. Did any of these neighbors, did Denmark or any of these near neighbors since 1990 reduce the generosity of this support for the elderly? I want to start with 1990 and not mid 90s, because mid 90s is a crisis for a lot of these countries and these support ratios are pretty high. But the Netherlands did shift away, and they clearly did so that when you come over to the payoff graph over here, their share of GDP spent on this has not gone up, clearly not. They are the best behaviors in that respect. We would furrow our brows and worry a bit about Finland in this respect, going up. Denmark, like the Americans, kind of, the jury is still out. Okay, how should these things be controlled? I need to wrap up here. If you went back to that kind of simple accounting identity equation I used, it allows you to see 2 points about the relationship of the aging process to what should be done and what could be done in kind of a social compact, which doesn't sort of single out any particular group. The social compact works something like this. It's indexing. The Swedes are close to it with what they call notional, they misleadingly call notional defined contribution plans. They get close to this, and they're doing perhaps the best exemplary job of this so far, which is what you really can afford is to let the pensions over the entire elderly phase of a person's life keep pace with annual earning power, GDP per young adult. That you can afford if you work it right, if you get the demography right and watch out for what's happening to senior life expectancy. What you cannot afford is to have the annual benefits keep pace. They must be indexed downward as the way the Swedes do it, as there's an improvement in the life expectancy of a person age 60. And the nice thing, social thing about this is that the constraint is imposed collectively on the entire age group, not on an individual. They're not doing something to your personal pension so much. It's just everybody's being indexed the same way. Your pension will still depend on your earnings history as an individual, et cetera. Okay, I need to get stopping here. I had some revisions about Chile's pension reforms. They have been misinterpreted. They've been emulated. It was fashionable back in the Washington Consensus of the 1990s for everybody to think, Chile is leading the way, etc. Many other countries imitated them. Those in Latin America have more or less, not Argentina, but the others have stuck with the kind of Chilean-inspired model, and the Europeans have bailed out of it. The reason I offer here on the screen very quickly is because what was the alternative? In Latin American countries, frankly, you might as well stick with your Chilean-inspired reforms, because the only other kind of political outcome that that Latin American countries tend to get is a terrible, rotting old system, as there was in Chile, whereas Britain and other Europeans found it easier to retreat and forget this fashion and go back to basically, they're more workable systems of progressive pensions, etc. Okay, skip COVID, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. If you could unshare your screen now for a moment.
Yes, there we are.
And thank you for a very detailed and sweeping presentation. Let's cut to the chase straight away. If you could indicate your questions either by hands or in the chat window. And let me see, we have hands, show of hands. Nothing yet. I hear one. This is Frederick Pfeiffer.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for the very good lecture. It was very interesting. I've been actually looking at some of these countries myself in the past weeks, studying their social expenditure, and I was thinking. So you showed Greece, and I mean, there clearly was to see a drastic jump just shortly before 2010. Do you think that's mainly because of because of their reaction to the financial crisis and cutting basically all the other things away, but not the pension benefits in that regard? Or do you have any theory on this? Why was the pension one the one that was so hard to draw back on? I mean, seriously, they also had a problem with their GDP falling, obviously, so that might be an indicator as well as to why their pension expenditure share rises up. But what is your opinion there on why they find it so hard to retreat on this?
They find it hard in the way that so many other countries do too. It's very hard to retreat on pensions, and you correctly identified, Friedrich, the one reason for the jump, which is simply that the denominator drops radically. The GDP drops so badly there, and they just could not politically hold together. Either the left or their critics could not hold together a political coalition without continuing to offer something in pensions. They have done some trimming of they've put some lid on the public pensions since then, but it was very high for those reasons. GDP was in terrible crisis. In addition, remember that they were caught with the overspending on the Athens Olympics a decade earlier, or decade, whatever, how many years earlier, and that was a further problem in the case of Greece.
We have Lasse Askoven.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for an extremely interesting talk. I was wondering whether you have given any thought to the potential differences both between autocracies and democracies, and also within autocracies themselves. Because when I look at the effect of those who had really, really high levels of elderly bias in their spending priorities, a lot of them are autocracies. And if we look at the history, and also some recent research suggests that autocracies sometimes invest in education, even though we are associated with democracies, and sometimes they also even invest in elderly pensions. But they do this as sort of an autocratic survival strategy. And maybe it seems to be the case that in the 21st century, investing in education is not no longer a viable autocratic survival strategy, whereas investing perhaps in elderly pensions might be a more viable autocratic survival strategy. Perhaps also because, again, as a democratic government, you can perhaps survive the political showdown, or you might even be able to come back after having lost. Whereas an autocrat, if you lose, you lose big time. That's why you want to avoid these showdowns, these political showdowns involving changes to the pension system. But I don't know whether you have given any thought to this.
I have now but I take your question, Lisa, to be mainly about the autocrats and their regime survival, right?
Yes.
It's mainly about them. Let's think in those cases. We get a variety of outcomes. It is generally true that even before the regimes were clearly in trouble, and I'm talking now really about post-war comparisons as I say this, they were not generous toward the elderly. There are famous references to the Iron Rice Bowl, etc. but really neither the communist, I'm pausing here, let's see, nor the other autocracies were particularly generous. So that when they got into a regime crisis, I think I'm saying this correctly on the spot, they did not end up slashing the pensions too much. They didn't have to, they were not that high. And if you went back to my China and Russia, etc., China in particular, you would find that they really never gave that much to the elderly. And now in more recent times, they clearly are keeping the lid down on pensions for the elderly. They have been able to survive that way. So what they have done in terms of regime survival is they've not cut them. They've not cut the generosity. Didn't have to, just by keeping the elderly about as badly off as they were before, with grandma now having to take care of the children a lot, because the grandchildren, because the young adults are off in a different city at work. The elderly are still being very much squeezed. China and Singapore are interesting cases in that they are cases where the winning generations in this intergenerational policy area are the young, because they didn't live through all of the bad times of the elderly under earlier communism, and they win. That's the opposite of the elderly bias that we were looking at in most of the countries here.
Three further hands, Keith, Paul, and Jeppe, in that order. Keith, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if your framework could be used to kind of understand the intergenerational transfer of welfare brought about by these non-pharmaceutical interventions and school closures done to kind of protect the elderly generation. Because I was kind of thinking about this and thinking about, looking at, we do these monetary things, but then we have all these policies that we've implemented over the past 2+ years now, it seems like. And I was just wondering if this is kind of a good thought exercise in trying to understand these kind of costs that are being borne by one portion of the age distribution in order to protect the other portion of the distribution.
On your school closures, Keith, you've got some specific example in mind. What are your school closures and the elderly? Give me the connection.
Okay. So the idea is because we're worried about transmission of COVID, we want to lower transmission. We close schools for a year or up to 2 years in some places in order to lower the potential risk of exposure for the most vulnerable people, which tend to be the older generation. And we know that there's going to be learning loss that could be we're not really investing to make up for. We're not having summer schools. We're not trying to really kind of reach back to these children. We're just saying, well, we're just going to push them forward. And so they might have lost a year or two of education. And I'm just kind of thinking about that. And when we just look at the expenditures, we might not be really getting at that also.
Well, and so that's a COVID specific and extremely currently important issue. What was the alternative? And they could have kept the schools open. And now I say, yeah, this actually kind of relates to the funny way in which the Swedes stumbled into this. This is not one of their big areas of policy success. You had the option also of simply making sure that the elderly were shut in, right? And Sweden missed that in the early going, in the year 2020. So there was a case where you could have done something different between the two. I'll hesitate to go from COVID back to our general theme here, though. But you're right; it's of extreme importance. Paul was up, I think.
Yes.
Thanks, Keith.
Yes, here I am. Thanks for a really, hi Peter, thanks for a really interesting talk. I had like one comment and one sort of quick question. The comment was actually about it's Sweden again, I'm afraid. So you mentioned Sweden in connection with the school reform they had in 1992. And just by pure chance, yesterday I was reading up on this in connection with the grant application. And apparently it's been criticized quite a lot recently within a committee in Sweden because it has led to increasing levels of inequality within Sweden. So this is sort of a negative part of this reform, whereas on your slide you mentioned more the positive parts, but apparently it's been causing social divisions within Sweden, it's been argued for at least. In a similar way to the similar system in Denmark, actually, more or less, I would say. The question was relating to the English example. So you started off by showing how England was very late in introducing compulsory primary education, but I mean, it's also kind of an outlier in that sense, right? So somewhere like Denmark introduced it very early on, even though it was a relatively poor country. So is this just saying something about the uniqueness of England, which is, you know, the case in many different dimensions, of course?
So I'll throw down the suggestion that I think that was true. You could have gotten a similar result on rates of return that were missed for any advanced West European country across the 18th century and early 19th. I believe that would be true of all of them. Now, England was different in the respect that across the Victorian times, up until 1891, England did a worse job of this than other leading countries. Yes, they were different in that respect. But I think that my larger theme for 18th century, early 19th, I'll bet you could get this massive foregone rate of return result for the Netherlands, for France, for Spain. I think the same would have been true for all of them. That particular result, let's see. That result was early 19th century, the calculation that I based on the work of David Mitch in that case. But where England becomes separate, as you're saying, is across the Victorian era, where they really are slower to get the right kind of solution to the issue of schools versus religions. You're right, they are different, but I think that particular calculation, and I want to push that idea, is something, I bet we could get that for Western Europe, many countries, early modern period, specifically 18th century, first half of the 19th. I bet they were all making the same mistake.
All right, I believe we have time for one more question. Jeppe, please.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I think I have two questions. The first one concerns this with the primary education systems. Is the literature on school choice very clear and in total agreement that if the system lives up to these criteria that you mentioned, then there will be a gain in learning and in growth?
The literature,
is it complete in agreement on that? And what is the level for being equally accessible? This was one of your criteria for a good system of choice, to be equally accessible for all. What would that level be in regard to a possible fee? The other question concerns the pensions. You didn't say much about public versus privately saved pensions. What is the data saying about that? Because at least in the Danish case, there was a very big shift on this in the 1980s and the 1990s. Thank you.
Second one first, the public and private pensions. The book kind of goes through that in the following way. Let me pause and think how quickly to say this. There are private pensions that are simply voluntary. Okay, that the third pillar, fine, and there's no controversy. Yeah, that's everybody's individual choice. the book is harder on the second pillar solutions, the mandatory private, locked up under government control, et cetera. I'm negative on those in a variety of ways because there's a variety of ways that they happen. The other main point on that is that in the book, I say, okay, I'm very interested in the public pension issue, and I got your focus on that. But the book is I try to make it very clear. If there were no pension systems at all, we would have the same issue of the problem of aging. Suppose that you individually cover your entire retirement out of your earnings. The greater the share of your life that you will go on to spend beyond the earnings period, the lower must be your consumption on the average relative to your average earnings per year when you were earning. That's simply a basic demographic fact that would be true even of the individual. I go on to talk about this in the context of public policy, but it is not a problem of having the public do it. Quickly on your earlier question, does the literature agree on school choices having to have these criteria? No, the literature does not. That's me pushing that result for your consideration.
Okay, and that's also a perfect rationale for reading up on the book itself. Lots of detail as well as a sweeping sort of a bird's eye view on the larger picture. I can only highly recommend it. Thank you very much, Peter, for a very informative talk. We are sure the lines are open for the future. We hope to get you here really in person at some stage.
Yeah.
And for now, let me thank you for a good talk. Thank you all for attending also.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Okay.